what is the message? What's going on with the Cowboys here? I guess the big question, who is making these moves? Who's making these decisions? Sources are saying that, multiple sources are saying, George Edwards, Leon Lett, Skip Peete, Joe Philbin, all are being released. Other names, Rob Davis, assistant head coach, offensive assistant Kyle Valero, being released as well. And Mike McCarthy, this is where I was like, oh man, this is a Mike McCarthy, he's gone out of here kind of situation. He's moving on. They're moving on from whole coaching staff. Sean Payton already said, here's my list of coaches, go find them for me. This is where, though, I'm like, they wouldn't let Mike McCarthy do a press conference at 3 o'clock. Is that tomorrow or today?
Today.
That's today. Today
on
at 3 o'clock.
Fan.
Yeah, on the Fan. It'll be right here doing the G-Bag Nation. They wouldn't let him do the press conference if they were moving on from him. So I'm wondering, Mike, is this, they said, we're moving on from these contracts, good luck, Mike McCarthy? Or Mike McCarthy said, hey, I want some new coaches in here anyway. These were all kind of carryovers from the past. We got to get better.
Great question. I honestly have no idea what's going on. I'm not for this. I'm not against this. It makes me wonder, it's just a theory. Do they already know Dan Quinn is accepting a job somewhere, and they already know who their actual next defensive coordinator is, and they know that defensive coordinator wants those spots available for a couple of his guys to come into? We know that the Jones family, for the most part, does not allow coaches to pick their staff. You have to be Bill Parcells to be able to have that type of power. So I'm just wondering. I don't know. I'm throwing theories out there. This is not like, oh, I believe this. I don't know why. If I look at Leon Lett, Tampa Bay and San Francisco, the playoff games, I thought the defensive line played pretty darn good. I thought obviously they dominated Tampa Bay, and they were really good for the most part against San Francisco. So I don't know how to blame him. I don't know how to go, man, all right, fine, they were good in the playoffs, but they were horrible in the regular season. No, they were pretty darn good in the regular season. They obviously had issues when Hankins got hurt and when they didn't have Hankins. But I don't know. I don't know. For Philbin, I know that there's been a lot of criticism about him, but I thought the offensive line had a good year this year. Yeah. I thought they did a good job.
Just a lot, didn't they?
Right. There's a lot of adjustments. They did good for the running backs for the most part. They did good for the quarterbacks for the most part. So to say, well, he had a bad year or they underperformed, I don't think you can say that. So I'm confused on these firings because, Tolos, I'll throw it out there to you. Text in, tweet in, Twitch in, does it matter to you that they let go of positional coaches? Because for me, I'll just say me. Head coach, offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator. Those are the coaches that, to me, make a major difference.
Yes.
And then if one thing is really bad, if the secondary was horrible this whole season, I would be like, okay, man, the secondary is horrible the whole season. You got to get a new secondary coach. Like, for me, the only coach that I would fire, and it might not be his fault, I would fire the quarterback's coach.
Okay.
And I would say, I got to get through. Dak Prescott, to me, sounded like a drug addict this year.
Doug Nussmeier, then.
Nussmeier.
All right.
Here's Dak Prescott. He sounds like a drug addict all year. But I'm going to stop it next week. And then you'd see another interception or two, and he'd be like, don't worry, next week. And then you're like, well, you turn back to drugs again, Dak. And he's like, but next week, I'm telling you next week. And then he wouldn't. You're like, all right, man, he stayed off drugs. And then the next week, you're like, you're back on drugs, Dak. And he's like, don't you worry. I know 8 out of 10 times I've done drugs when I told you I wouldn't. But next year, I'm not doing drugs.
He's Mike, okay, in that instance, maybe he was just waiting for his new season's resolution. All right? For that moment.
But I think
all right,
that, like,
once the season's over, then I'll stop.
And it might not be Nussmeier's fault.
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
But I would hire somebody new to, like, we have to get through to Dak. Because even though he's saying he knows they're wrong, he knows he shouldn't do them, we all know that not all of it is his fault. We know that sometimes you hit a dude in the chest and it pops up, and there's nothing Dak can do when you hit a dude in the chest and they don't catch the ball and it goes into some other team's hands. I totally get that. They're not all Dak's fault. But enough of them were Dak's fault where you go, hey, we got to get somebody else in here if we're going to keep the offensive coordinator, and we don't know that yet, but it sounds like they're leaning towards that. Got to get somebody in here to help him out on these bad reads that he is making more than most other NFL quarterbacks.
Yeah, and I mean, that is kind of the carryover with the conversation with Kellen Moore and Nussmeier and what they're trying to accomplish. And I honestly, that's the other thing, too, that I would love to sit down with maybe McClay, Quinn, one of those guys, and have the conversation of, all right, so how much of your job is drawing up the plan and installing it, and how much of the assistants' jobs are making sure they understand all the nuances of your installment? Like, that's one thing I would love to know a little more about, because then we can figure out some other things too. But you have a really good thought on, if they know Kellen Moore is going to Carolina, which I believe that Chris Richard is interviewing over there as well. If they know that Dan Quinn is already moving on, then they are probably starting to clear some way there. What's interesting to me, and this is from the 806, Philbin and Rob Davis are huge because those are big, close guys to McCarthy. They are big McCarthy guys. Joe Philbin coached with McCarthy for a very long time. I thought for some reason he'd been around here, but he was with McCarthy for a long time, and Rob Davis is essentially his right-hand man. So that's where I was like, oh, man, lots of concern for Mike McCarthy. Why would you take away people that are that close to him that help him gain the structure that they've had this year, which this was a team that really did continue to battle through things easily a lot of times. Like 12 wins is not an easy thing to come by. Ask
right.
Jason Garrett. He didn't do it that often.
Right. And I think to your point, I am a Mike McCarthy fan in this. I do think you're limited as the Cowboys coach. I think he's way better than Jason Garrett. Jason Garrett in his wildest dreams could never win 12 games in a row in the NFL. He's just not a good enough coach. He's a below average coach. He's a below average offensive coordinator. He's a below average head coach. And we saw that play out for over a decade. I think Mike McCarthy is an above average coach. Now, I think there's going to be a lot of Cowboy fans that don't agree with me on that. I don't think he is Shanahan. I do not think that he is Andy Reid. I don't think he's Bill Belichick. I don't think he's McVay. I think there's probably a good 5 to 10 people that you tell me they're a head coach in the NFL, and I will tell you, they are probably better than Mike McCarthy. But you also have to realize most coaches don't want to be here. Mm-hmm. The best of the best don't want to coach the Dallas Cowboys. There's restrictions and limitations as the head coach of the Dallas Cowboys. So for the restrictions and the limitations of being the Dallas Cowboys head coach, I think Mike McCarthy is a great fit here.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you on that at all. I'm kind of looking at the fan text right now, Mike. One person from the 816 says, guys, all these issues with Dak are things that should be discussed with young quarterbacks, not 7-year veterans. Red flag, red flag. I think you got a valid point. I also believe that this dude has been with one thought on how football is played, and that was the Jason Garrett, Linehan, now Kellen Moore, and they were all together.
Right.
So it makes sense if you're McCarthy to look at it and go, well, I can clear myself and rid myself of maybe some of those things. Those habits are going to pop up. Those feelings of I have to do this, but maybe a new voice, maybe a new theory, a new philosophy on how to play quarterback would help him just a little bit. My big thing is trying to figure out what Jerry and Steven are trying to accomplish.
Yeah.
Because Steven wanted McClay. He sold McClay to Jerry.
Yeah. McClay's good.
Yeah. I'm sorry, not McClay. Okay. McCarthy.
Okay.
Yes, McClay's good too. Thank you, Mike. But he sold McCarthy to Jerry. He sold the whole family sold it to Jerry to make that decision. So that's where I'm trying to figure out how he still feels about it and where their next move is going to be.
Yeah, and that's where I just don't think Cowboy fans, correct me if you feel different or support me if you feel the same way. I don't feel like whoever replaces Leon Lett is going to make the defensive line much better. I don't think maybe I'm wrong about
this. Maybe that is a trim the fat kind of thing that Choppy was talking about. There are some assistants names, and maybe Jerry's like, we don't need those guys. Let's go ahead and have you do your job, and we'll be fine. We don't have to have all these assistants. I saw a tweet from Kevin Gray on the Get Right. Always listen to the Get Right with Kevin Gray and Reggie. And he said, this is Jerry, or this is the Cowboys putting Mike McCarthy on notice for next year. And do you feel that way? That didn't he kind of already get put on notice last year? And then you saw Mike McCarthy going on interview tours and all this, trying to discuss it.
I would say he's on notice that if they miss the playoffs, he gets let go. But as long as he makes the playoffs, he's going to be the coach of the Cowboys the next year.
Seems reasonable.
Yeah.
And keep doing that, and you're going to have a better shot than, hey, you don't know. Like, you can go back to the Jason Garrett era, and you never know if you're going to make the playoffs.
I think people get confused on when Jerry's been quoted 100 times on this station, I don't have time to have a bad time. That's not about winning Super Bowls. It has nothing to do with winning Super Bowls. He wants to have a good time in that Frisco office. He wants to have a good time at the football games. He wants to have a good time in the locker room.
On the airplane, on the bus, yeah.
It has nothing to do with winning and losing. The good time is he doesn't want to deal with a Bill Parcells ever again, and he never will. And I think people get confused on that when I listen to the national people, Corey, and they're like, hey, Dak Prescott, this is last year as Cowboys quarterback if he doesn't get to a championship game. No, it's not.
Yeah, that makes sense.
McCarthy's going to get fired if he doesn't go to a championship game next year. No, he's not. If the Cowboys win 10 games next year, which would be 2 games worse than the last 2 years, 10 games will get you in the playoffs. They will be a wild card team. That keeps our audience grows as the season goes because 10 wins is the greatest thing to Cowboys fans. I know you say you want more, but you're so engaged. There's so many storylines throughout a 10-win season, and then you do make the playoffs. That's a good time. That's Jerry's good time. And Mike McCarthy's not going to rock the boat.